I am pleased to introduce Michael Birkin as the keynote speaker for our next section devoted to the future of the consumer. Michael's the CEO of Q, which is a collective of strategically curated companies that include the likes of IDEO, BEworks, SY Partners, Godfrey Daddick, and many other impressive global firms. In his talk titled Reshaping the Future of Humanity by Rethinking the Consumer, Michael's going to share his perspectives on how we need to rethink the role of the consumer. Michael believes that businesses must, more than ever, understand the complexities of human experience and how best to harness it towards societal progress. Together, we'll explore whether seeing people as consumers serves the goal or is now a new reimagining in order. Michael began his marketing career as CEO of brand consultancy Interbrand. He also founded Red Peak Group, was the CMO of Acer before creating Q with Hakuhodo Holdings of Japan. Stay tuned for my fireside chat with Michael following this talk. Michael, welcome. How are you?
Hello, Tony. I'm very well. I'm in Dubai this evening, so I hope you can hear me okay.
I can hear you. It's trying to chase you around the world. It's like catch me if you can. You must be the 7 million mile club. But listen, we appreciate you joining us. And I want to begin, before we really get into the essence of the talk about your feeling about reshaping how we frame the consumer. I have to tell you, you came on my radar years ago when you were running Interbrand. You came up with this whole idea of creating a value for a brand. And I don't know if that initially was just an idea to create some attention, but it became this global force. I mean, we looked every year to see how you rank brands. So first of all, tell me what was the motivation for doing it and what were you hoping to achieve by putting a value on a brand beyond assets?
Well, it was desperation, actually, Tony. We were probably about 6 weeks from going out of business as a naming company, and we really had to do something. I was a pretty young CEO back then, talking about the mid-'80s. And one day I was just reading a piece in the Lex column in the Financial Times and saw that Nestle were taking over the UK confectionery company Rowntree's, and the reason they were paying such a premium over net assets was because of the value of the brands. And it occurred to me that somebody one day would come up with a system for doing that. And I felt we probably had as good a chance as any. And so we very quickly developed a methodology, and I managed to sell it into a major UK PLC. And then it really, really took off. But it was born out of necessity. I mean, we really would not have survived as a company had we not come up with it. But I think it was the importance of it, even though I didn't know it at the time, was that for the first time it brought finance people and the financial community into the world of advertising and marketing. I think prior to brand valuation, the financial community, certainly chief financial officers and their teams, would regard marketing as just a black hole where you just poured money and nobody knew whether it made any sense or not. And for the first time, by putting significant values on these assets, because they are significantly valued, it changed the dynamic. And that was the lasting benefit of that initiative, I think.
You could argue that your initiative and just this whole new mindset of CFOs and CEOs valuing the goodwill with their brand, the intrinsic value, that added hundreds of billions of dollars to balance sheets. And that was really when brands, like people define themselves, I'm young, I drink Pepsi, and I'm Americana, I drink Coca-Cola. But today I look around the marketplace and it seems that a lot of brands are relying more on selling on value versus their intrinsic value. Do you think there's still room for brands to stand out and stand for something where consumers are willing to pay a premium for it?
Well, I hope so. Otherwise, I'm going to go out of business pretty quickly, I think. You're right, Tony. I mean, I think that the Gen Z do look at the world very differently. And I do think that value has perhaps become more important. But I still believe in branding. You have to call things by a name. That name connotes or denotes a series of values. And those are values that can be enhanced by good new product development and the right communications. And I don't believe fundamentally that has changed, even though in specific situations, and you've just described one perhaps, it has.
So let's talk about Kelly Peters at BEworks, because they're a stellar example of someone that is really, with conviction and confidence, really going after some of the meaty problems you're talking about. When you partnered with them, as I read, you talked a lot about behavioral economics as being this oxygen that could breathe life into a lot of opportunities. Tell me a little bit about why behavioral economics is to your mind, use one of your superpowers. Keep on the comic book analogy.
Well, if I had one word to answer the question, which I don't have, there is one word, it's depth is the word. I think that the major issue that a company like Q has in fulfilling its aspirations to tackle the world's biggest problems and not let McKinsey or Accenture get them all, is we have to demonstrate that we're not just from a traditional creative mindset, but there's actually depth in the quality of our thinking and in the support for the decisions and the solutions that we create. That's not easy to do when you come from a sort of advertising marketing background, a design background even, although I would always argue at the risk of being stoned by a lot of people in my profession that designers by definition have a depth that many others don't have. So I'm afraid I don't need, design is a bit of an exception in the pantheon of creative services in that sense. But the fact of the matter remains that to persuade very senior people to spend a lot of money in solving problems, you need to demonstrate a depth in your approach. People, even the most adventurous people, need a degree of reassurance. I'm not always sure that the advertising profession per se has always been able to demonstrate that. One or two maybe, but not many. So to me, behavioral economics was a fairly obvious way to go to actually create that support, to be able to challenge thinking and to provide evidence behind why something makes sense. And it's not an easy thing to do. I mean, behavioral economics is a science. It's defined as a science. Scientific thinking is very different from much artistic thinking. But the great moves that have ever been made, in my opinion, in society, whether you're talking about Italy in the 15th century or Florence in the 15th century specifically, or Paris in the 18th century is another example, has been this confluence of art and science. And that has to happen this century if a creatively led organization is going to have the right to serve major institutions on big problem solving and have more than just the right, but actually can deliver what it needs to deliver. So to me, it was not just a nice to have, it was an absolute essential. And we had to be the organization that would pioneer the way in which behavioral economics would increasingly become a part and second nature to artistic and creative thinking.
So, Michael, I love the way you framed, points in history where creativity and science came together, and we saw this renaissance. And I know you're a massive collector and thought leader in Renaissance art, so you've studied that period. Talk to me about, you talked about reframing the corporation so they embody the sense of scientific process and thinking, behavioral economics. But part of what we want you to talk about today is you've come out with a fairly bold statement that got a lot of attention when you said, maybe it's time that we reframe the consumer and really rethink what this concept of consumerism is all about. Can you spend a few minutes and share with us what your thesis is and why do you feel it's something that would matter to our audience?
Well, Tony, I mean, what I'm about to say is not my own. It's my own thinking only because I've been given it, and or not just given it, but being very happy to adopt it. But one of the things that I inherited when I decided that I would do this with Takehodo DY in Japan was I adopted a philosophy that pervaded HDY for well over 50 years. The organization is over 100 years old. But for the second half of the 20th century, the philosophy that pervades Takehodo's way of thinking is a Japanese philosophy called Seikatsu Sha, which is not an easy philosophy to describe in English, but it essentially means that you look at people as human beings and not as consumers. The word consumer is not a word that I like, if you think about it. And user is another one that sometimes used as its proxy. They're both horrible words if you actually think about what they literally mean. Seikatsu Sha is essentially a way of cutting through human beings and not looking at them as just users or consumers of what it is that you're doing, but essentially as human beings, 360-degree people, and looking at the way they think, the way they love, the way they nurture, or the way they're nurtured, what they eat, what they wear, and the way they live their lives. And it pervades not just a way of looking at them, but actually a whole spirit around partnership with people. So the way of creating in a Seikatsu Sha environment is around, the Japanese describe it as a well, like a well where you get water and everybody congregates around it and essentially creates something because of that congregation, as opposed to the classic way of marketing, which is they call it the river model, where you look at people on the other side of a river and essentially it's potluck whether you nail what it is you're meant to be doing in your message and the dissemination of the message. And so that philosophy actually underpins our whole thinking about consumers, if we have to use that word, or we need to use that word, because humanity is written in to the very way we think about the people that we're trying to address. And that essentially has been with us from the start of Q and is the way that we look at a 21st century consumer, because the philosophy, if anything, is more valid now than it was in the 1950s when it essentially was adopted by my organization.
Michael Birkin, it's been an honor getting to know you over the last couple of weeks and reading some of your thinking. And, the real takeaway for people listening, one is, this is a person that has great humility. I mean, right away, I had no choice. We were 6 weeks away from going bankrupt. By creating this interbrand strategy, the real magic wasn't so much building business. It was bringing other people to the table, bringing the CEOs and the CFOs. I think the fact that you're creating something for the future, but roots to the past, is a great second lesson in life that we discard. But the fact that you're moving forward, and that's part of your knapsack. And the third thing is just the way you talk with such pride, not only about the partners that are out there pushing the edge, as you said, but creating something that will be quite historic. It's been a pleasure to have you with us, and wherever you're going next, safe travels.
Thank you, Tony. And I've thoroughly enjoyed getting to know you a little too. So let's hope we can do this again, as long as it's not too tedious for everybody else.